The morning air over Dry Creek, Oklahoma carried the metallic taste of coming rain, though no one expected the sky to twist so quickly. On May 3, 2006, the seniors of Dry Creek High were halfway through a tornado preparedness drill when the town's new weather sirens began their wavering test cycle, echoing across the flat wheat fields like the memory of every storm that had ever scraped the prairie raw. By 11:27 a.m., the hallways smelled of dust and disinfectant as students crouched beneath lockers, laughing through their nerves while teachers counted heads and cafeteria trays cooled in the dark. Guidance aide Melissa Hartley moved from room to room, clipboard in hand, checking that every student had made it to safety. She was 28, newly divorced, and known for remembering every child's birthday, even when their parents forgot. When the all-clear sounded at 11:42, the students spilled back into sunlight that had already turned heavy with humidity. Melissa never re-emerged from the South Corridor. Before we continue this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light, and the algorithm gods will make sure you don't miss any future uploads. At first, nobody noticed. The drill had scattered staff between classrooms, and substitute rosters blurred responsibility. It wasn't until 12:15 when a sophomore named Kara Lowe stopped by the guidance office to ask about college forms that Principal Rick Vaughn realized the aide's desk sat empty, coffee still steaming beside a yellow notepad filled with reminders. Call OSU rep. Track transcripts. Lunch duty fry. Her purse rested on the chairback, keys hooked to a lanyard. Cell phone blinking with a missed call, time-stamped 11:39 a.m. Security cameras in the main hall recorded her entering the west stairwell at 11:33 with a stack of attendance sheets. The next frame at 11:35 showed the door swinging open to an empty landing. No sign of Melissa descending or returning. Within hours, Dry Creek became the latest dot on Oklahoma's long map of weather day tragedies, though the weather had held. Sheriff Tom Radley's first sweep of the high school lasted until midnight. Every closet, classroom, and maintenance shaft was searched. Custodians opened crawl spaces lined with decades of insulation dust. The single-story brick complex, built in 1971 after the old school burned, sat surrounded by 3 athletic fields and a scattering of portable classrooms connected by covered walkways. The storm shelters, concrete bunkers half buried behind the gym, were empty, their heavy metal doors propped open for inspection. Nothing. By 2 a.m., rain began to fall, washing away any tracks in the dirt lot behind the cafeteria. Reporters from Tulsa and Oklahoma City arrived by sunrise, turning the high school parking area into a blinking thicket of satellite vans. Interviews with faculty painted Melissa as kind, meticulous, recently anxious about something she wouldn't discuss. One teacher recalled seeing her arguing quietly with someone near the faculty lounge the previous afternoon, but couldn't identify the person. Her car, a white 2001 Ford Taurus, remained in the staff lot with the driver's door locked and umbrella on the front seat. No fingerprints beyond her own. The disappearance stretched into days, then weeks. Tornado season rolled across the plains, bringing fresh sirens and new anxieties, but no sign of the woman whose clipboard still hung behind the counselor's door. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation joined the case, classifying it officially as an endangered missing adult. Investigators drained nearby retention ponds, sifted drainage culverts, even tore up sections of newly paved highway after tipsters reported foul smells. The state's K-9 units picked up her scent near the south stairwell and lost it 10 feet later, as if the trail had been vacuum-sealed from existence. Superintendent Gail McPherson issued statements assuring parents that the school was safe, though attendance dropped by 20% within a month. Dry Creek, population 2,914, functioned like most prairie towns: closed ranks, polite silence, and a distrust of outside scrutiny. When FBI consultants arrived offering behavioral analysis support, Sheriff Radley insisted local law enforcement could handle it. He was 62, a former wheat farmer turned small-town lawman, and he'd never lost anyone without a body before. The summer of 2006 ended with no arrests, no remains, only rumors. That Melissa had run off with a teacher, that she'd been hiding an affair, that she'd discovered something about school finances. But behind closed doors, people whispered about the sirens, their timing, the drill, the shelter nobody ever opened because it had been sealed for renovation since March. Maintenance records showed the southernmost storm bunker had failed an inspection for mold and wiring issues. Work orders placed weeks before her disappearance indicated the shelter should have been locked pending repair. Yet photos from the day after the incident showed the padlock missing, its chain resting in the red clay like something dropped in haste. When Radley questioned the maintenance crew, each man swore the shelter had been secured. Only one, Doug Hendricks, a custodian who'd worked there since the 80s, hesitated before answering. He said he thought he'd heard someone inside the shelter during the drill, muffled, brief, maybe just echoing footsteps, but when he tried the handle it wouldn't budge, so he'd assumed it was locked. The sheriff made a note of the comment and filed it under unconfirmed. For 13 years that single remark would remain buried in a stack of reports, until a misfiled emergency radio recording forced everyone to listen again. The sound on the tape began with wind, the kind of dry, static-laced gust that makes prairie fences hum. Then came a voice, male, nervous, out of breath, calling into a two-way radio. "Base, this is Unit 6. I got movement by the south shelter." The timestamp on the file read 11:36 a.m. May 3, 2006, 2 minutes after Melissa Hartley was last seen on camera. The recording had been mislabeled during a digital migration project in 2017 and stored under Drill Test Audio Backup. It might have stayed buried forever, if not for a 2019 audit conducted by the new emergency management director, a woman named Kelsey Rudd, who found the orphaned file while updating the county's FEMA compliance system. When she played it out of curiosity, the voice on the recording mentioned something that froze her hand above the keyboard. "Doors half open. Looks like the latch gave way. I think somebody's in there." Then silence, a long hiss of open channel, followed by, "Base, disregard, must have been debris. No, wait," before the tape cut out. By then, 13 years had passed since the storm drill disappearance that had defined Dry Creek's collective paranoia. The high school had been renovated twice, the old south corridor replaced with a new science wing, and the damaged shelter sealed permanently under concrete. Sheriff Radley had retired to Arkansas. The case file sat boxed in the Grady County Evidence Room under missing person, Hartley, Melissa A. When Rudd sent the rediscovered recording to the county sheriff's office for archiving, Deputy Eli Mercer, a 34-year-old investigator with a background in disaster communications, recognized the potential significance immediately. The radio voice belonged to Deputy Aaron Leake, who died in a tractor rollover accident in 2012. Leake's patrol logs confirmed he'd been assigned to monitor the drill that day, stationed at the high school's south field to ensure emergency vehicle access remained clear. Mercer reopened the cold file unofficially, spending evenings combing through old statements, photographs, and the thin forensic record left from 2006. Many of the original evidence bags had degraded. Labels were smudged by time and Oklahoma humidity. The only physical item recovered near the south shelter had been a single button. Plastic, pearly white, engraved with the manufacturer code HF7, consistent with Melissa's cardigan. Investigators at the time had dismissed it as likely dislodged earlier in the day. Mercer wasn't convinced. He drove out to Dry Creek High one night in April 2019, parking near the athletic field under sodium lamps that buzzed with insects. The shelter itself was gone, buried under the expanded gymnasium, but the earth still sloped downward where the entrance had once been. He stood there for a long time, listening to the same wind that had filled Leake's radio. Something about the tape, its abrupt cut, that fragment of panic in the deputy's voice, suggested an interrupted discovery, not a false alarm. He filed for official reclassification of the Hartley disappearance as a potential unresolved homicide, which authorized limited evidence re-examination. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation assigned forensic analyst Dana Cullum to assist, a methodical scientist known for using environmental DNA techniques on decades-old samples. Cullum began by testing the button, which had sat untouched for 13 years in a paper envelope. Her lab isolated microscopic pollen grains trapped within the thread grooves, an unusual mix of Ambrosia artemisifolia, ragweed, and Celtis levigata, hackberry. Ragweed was common across the region, but hackberry pollen appeared only in specific floodplain areas near Dry Creek Lake, 7 miles east of the school. The discovery shifted the investigation's focus dramatically. Mercer and Cullum visited the lake site on May 10, 2019, guided by GIS vegetation maps from the Agriculture Department. Along the southern edge, near an abandoned maintenance road, they found remnants of a concrete structure protruding from the soil. Rebar, rusted hinges, a warped metal door half swallowed by the earth. The serial tag on the hinge plate matched the storm shelter manufacturer contracted by the school district in 2001. It was the missing southern bunker. Inside, years of silt and water had created a thick mineral crust over the floor. A small depression near the corner caught Mercer's eye, as if something heavier than the surrounding debris had once rested there. Excavation crews arrived 2 days later with forensic anthropologists from Oklahoma State University. The remains surfaced by the third afternoon. Partial skeletal elements, fragments of clothing fibers consistent with school-issued lanyards, and a laminated badge bearing the faded imprint M. Hartley, guidance aide. The official identification came through dental records within 48 hours. For Dry Creek, the confirmation hit like a delayed shockwave from the same storm they'd all thought had passed. Local television replayed 2006 news footage in looping montages, intercut with new interviews of gray-haired teachers who still couldn't believe she'd been right under our feet. At a press conference, Sheriff's Office spokesman emphasized that this was no longer a missing persons case, but a homicide investigation with active leads. The crime scene reconstruction revealed critical anomalies. The shelter's interior locking mechanism had been deliberately jammed from the outside using a bent steel rod, preventing egress. The air vents were sealed with duct tape layered beneath storm caulking, ensuring anyone trapped inside would have suffocated within hours. The coroner estimated Melissa's death occurred between 11:45 a.m. and 2 p.m., consistent with asphyxiation due to oxygen depletion. More disturbing still were the traces found on the inner handle, minute residues of industrial adhesive, the type used in HVAC maintenance. The school's custodial records listed only 2 employees trained for that material in 2006, Doug Hendricks and Caleb Shore. Hendricks had died in 2009 of a stroke. Shore was alive, 52, living outside Enid, working as a repair subcontractor for tornado shelter installations. Mercer's first visit to Shore's residence took place on June 3, 2019. The man answered the door with the hollow caution of someone accustomed to unexpected knocks. He was thin, prematurely stooped, his fingers stained with sealant and motor oil. When Mercer mentioned the reopened Dry Creek investigation, Shore's jaw tightened, but he invited the detective inside, insisting he'd already told the police everything back in '06. His account matched his original statement almost word for word. He'd been off campus during the drill, picking up replacement hinges from a hardware supplier in Lawton. He still had the invoice, he said, though when Mercer requested to see it, Shore admitted it had long since been lost. Back at headquarters, Mercer reviewed archived procurement records and discovered a discrepancy. The hardware delivery receipt logged that day had been signed by another custodian, not Shore. Moreover, surveillance from a neighboring gas station, recovered from analog backups, showed Shore's distinctive red Chevy service truck entering the high school lot at 11:25 a.m. Minutes before the drill began. Forensics teams later matched flakes of industrial adhesive from the truck's cargo bed to the residue on the shelter latch. Mercer confronted Shore again 2 days later, this time at the county office with recording equipment active. The interview began calmly, questions about maintenance schedules and key control, but when Mercer produced photographs of the recovered shelter door, Shore's breathing changed. He leaned back, rubbed his temples, whispered that nobody was supposed to get hurt, and asked for water. The partial confession came in fragments, years of denial cracking under the pressure of simple factual precision. Shore claimed Melissa had confronted him the morning of the drill about rumors that he'd been stealing surplus repair materials and selling them to neighboring districts. She'd found a duplicate purchase order in the guidance office file cabinet while helping a student with work-study forms. Shore said she threatened to tell Principal Vaughn. He'd followed her during the drill, intending only to scare her into backing off, cornering her near the south shelter, where he was supposed to have replaced wiring weeks earlier. The argument escalated. She slipped on the muddy threshold, fell inside, and hit her head against the wall. Panicking, Shore locked the door, thinking she'd regain consciousness and yell for help once he left. Instead, he He sealed it, covering the vents, so no one would notice the smell, while planning to return later to move her. Then the rain came, flooding the area, and by the next morning he couldn't open the door without exposing himself. Sure, you're subscribed to stay updated on more cases like this. These families deserve to have their stories told, and your support helps ensure these victims are never forgotten. His story shifted repeatedly under questioning: accident, negligence, panic. But each version contained the same logistical impossibility. Melissa had been alive when he left her. The forensic report contradicted that claim. The bone fractures suggested blunt trauma delivered while upright, not from a fall. The adhesive layers on the vent seams were applied from the inside outward, implying that Shore had reopened the shelter hours later to conceal what he'd done. Mercer confronted him with the timeline inconsistencies. Shore broke down entirely, repeating that he'd heard her breathing and couldn't stand the sound. The arrest warrant was signed June 12, 2019. News of Shore's capture spread through Oklahoma media under headlines almost identical to those from 2003 in Michigan, small-town cold case. Finally solved, maintenance worker arrested. Residents of Dry Creek gathered outside the courthouse as the suspect was led in shackles, murmuring disbelief that the man who'd fixed their gutters and mowed the football field had sealed a woman alive beneath the gym. Melissa's parents, long since relocated to Texas, returned for the arraignment, their faces lined by years of quiet endurance. Deputy Mercer filed his closing report that night under the same fluorescent hum that had filled the guidance hallway 13 years earlier. He wrote that justice in small towns doesn't come fast. It seeps like water through clay, slow, patient, unstoppable once the cracks appear. The recovered audio, the pollen, the button, all artifacts of a storm drill meant to teach safety that had instead hidden murder. And somewhere in the static between wind gusts and fading radio chatter, a voice still waited for someone to finish, saying, "Wait." The courthouse smelled faintly of floor wax and old air conditioning, the kind of scent that settles into small-town buildings where everything ages a little slower. On the morning of June 18, 2019, the preliminary hearing of State of Oklahoma versus Caleb Shore began under skies thick with heat haze. Reporters from Tulsa, Oklahoma City, and even Wichita filled the gallery. For most of them, it was just another human interest piece, local closure, long-awaited justice. But for Dry Creek, it was the day ghosts would finally be named. Deputy Eli Mercer sat behind the prosecution table, hands folded over a worn notebook filled with handwritten margins and red-inked timestamps from the 2006 emergency drill. The district attorney, Catherine Dobbins, presented the state's case with the calm precision of someone who had waited years to say every sentence aloud. The evidence, though circumstantial, built a structure strong enough to hold weight. The adhesive residue matching Shore's supply orders, the recovered pollen grains linking Melissa's clothing to the floodplain shelter, and the 2019 radio audit proving that law enforcement had been within 50 feet of the murder scene without realizing it. Shore sat at the defense table wearing a beige jumpsuit, his wrists chained loosely before him. His attorney, a public defender from Chickasha named Brian Lorton, maintained that the death was accidental and that Shore's subsequent actions were the panicked decisions of a frightened man, not those of a killer. The hearing stretched across 3 humid days, each filled with procedural motions and witness statements that peeled back the facade of Dry Creek's institutional memory. Principal Rick Vaughn, now retired and living in Norman, took the stand on the second day. His voice trembled as he described realizing Melissa was missing, the phone call to the sheriff, the endless questions he couldn't answer. When asked if he'd ever suspected anyone on staff, Vaughn hesitated. "I thought about it every day for 10 years, he said. And every day I came back to the same conclusion. We didn't look close enough at our own people. The press coverage grew feverish by the time the hearing adjourned. Satellite vans lined Main Street, commentators replaying clips of Shore's earlier police interviews where his voice cracked under Mercer's steady questioning. Cable segments framed the story as another example of rural isolation breeding silence. How could a school employee hide a body under campus for 13 years? The town bristled under the scrutiny. Older residents refused interviews. Teachers closed classroom blinds when camera crews walked past. The local diner replaced its chalkboard "Special of the Day" sign with the words, "No Media." For a community that had spent over a decade defining itself by loss, national attention felt less like vindication and more like exposure. Inside the sheriff's department, Mercer continued combing through residual evidence even after the case file was technically complete. Something about Shore's confession felt too rehearsed, the details arranged for narrative coherence rather than accuracy. The man had confessed to sealing the vents, but forensic analysis of the adhesive application pattern revealed a second, lighter coat of sealant, applied from a different brand manufactured years later. That meant someone else had accessed the shelter after 2006, long after Melissa's death. When Mercer presented the discrepancy to Dobbins, she cautioned him against overcomplicating an already delicate prosecution, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't finished. He requested additional inventory audits from the school district's maintenance department. Buried within 2011 work orders, he found an entry labeled South Shelter Reinspection, Mold Remediation Follow-up, signed by a contractor named P. Norval. The job had been subcontracted through the county safety program during a flood mitigation grant. Mercer tracked the contractor to a small restoration company in Lawton. Norval, now 57, remembered the project immediately. "That job?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, weird one. We were told the shelter had been filled in years before, but there was still a cavity under the slab. Smelled like death down there. Figured it was some animal. The crew had sealed the vent shafts permanently afterward, under orders from the district maintenance supervisor at the time, Caleb Shore." Mercer pressed for details. Norval recalled finding an old metal locker, half-crushed, inside the cavity. It had been removed for disposal at a private landfill outside town. The locker's contents, according to his memory, included rotted clothing and something that looked like a purse. Mercer's chest tightened. None of that was in the 2019 recovery report because the excavation had focused on skeletal remains, not peripheral debris. He called the landfill operator, an elderly man named Ernest Clay, who confirmed that several school district waste loads had been deposited there in 2011, but were never logged due to a computer system change. Clay offered to let Mercer search the restricted section if he could handle the smell and bring his own equipment. 2 days later, under a sky stained red by dust and sunset, Mercer stood atop a heap of compacted refuse, the air dense with methane and heat. Using a backhoe borrowed from the county road crew, he directed excavation in the quadrant corresponding to the 2011 disposal records. After 4 hours, they unearthed a twisted rectangle of rusted metal, recognizable as the locker Norval described. Inside lay fragments of decayed fabric, a leather strap buckle, and a small badge clip identical to those issued to school staff. Beneath the debris, preserved by layers of anaerobic soil, was a folded document, water-damaged but legible enough to read the words, Dry Creek High School, Counseling Department, Confidential Student Report. The signature line carried the name Melissa Hartley. The report detailed anonymous student concerns about a staff member borrowing supply funds and threatening students to stay quiet. The initials CS appeared in the margin. Mercer realized the letter had never been processed. It had vanished the day Melissa disappeared. It provided motive far beyond accidental confrontation. When confronted with the document in jail, Shore initially denied knowledge, then admitted Melissa had shown it to him hours before the drill, demanding he explain discrepancies in purchasing records. He maintained he only meant to silence her temporarily, but something about his admission of others knowing caught Mercer's attention. "She wasn't supposed to tell them," Shore said during one late-night interview. "She promised she wouldn't bring them into it." Mercer replayed that phrase repeatedly over the next week. Them, not him, not anyone else. He began tracing who might have shared responsibility for the embezzlement scheme Melissa had uncovered. The school's procurement records listed multiple signatures on purchase approvals, including Principal Vaughn and Superintendent McPherson. Financial audits from 2005 revealed minor irregularities that had been written off as clerical errors. When Mercer revisited those ledgers with forensic accounting software, he found over $48,000 in unaccounted maintenance expenditures spread across 3 fiscal years, padded invoices tied to suppliers connected to McPherson's brother-in-law's contracting firm. When Mercer requested a formal interview, McPherson's attorney declined, citing health issues. The superintendent had retired in 2014 and was living in Edmond. However, an anonymous envelope arrived at the sheriff's office 2 days later, containing a handwritten note. You're digging where the county poured concrete for a reason. Some storms don't blow over. Inside the envelope was a single photograph, Melissa standing beside Principal Vaughn at the 2005 homecoming game, both smiling under the bleachers where donation boxes had been stored. The reverse side bore a faint handwritten annotation, Locker 12B. Mercer returned to the high school storage area that same night. The room had been converted into an equipment bay during the 2010 renovations, but the lockers along the north wall remained welded shut beneath fresh paint. Using a crowbar, he pried open the one labeled 12B. Inside, he found a sealed envelope discolored with time. The contents were photocopies of district invoices highlighting discrepancies between ordered materials and received shipments, each marked with Melissa's neat handwriting. Talk to Caleb. Numbers don't match. Attached to the final page was a printed email draft addressed to Superintendent McPherson requesting a formal audit. The timestamp read, May 3, 2006, 10:58 a.m., 40 minutes before the drill. By the time Mercer closed the locker door, again, the air inside the storage room felt colder than the Oklahoma night. The implication was unmistakable. Shore might have been the instrument of Melissa's death, but the motive had been institutional. The embezzlement she'd uncovered implicated people far above a maintenance worker's pay grade, and someone had ensured the investigation ended in silence. Whether those individuals had ordered Shore's actions or simply benefited from them remained unclear, but the paper trail was too precise to be coincidence. District Attorney Dobbins faced a strategic dilemma. Revealing potential administrative complicity risked derailing the current prosecution. Withholding it meant ignoring a broader conspiracy. She opted for a sealed supplemental investigation, tasking Mercer with discreetly gathering corroboration. Over the following month, he traced supplier payments to a dummy corporation registered in Texas under McPherson's brother-in-law's name. The company dissolved in 2007, months after the state allocated new funding for tornado shelter repairs. Financial transfers matched the inflated invoices that Melissa had flagged. The timing of her disappearance now appeared less like tragic accident and more like containment. By August 2019, with Shore awaiting trial, Mercer prepared a confidential memorandum for the state attorney general recommending expanded inquiry into the Grady County School Infrastructure Program. He delivered it personally to Dobbins's office, sliding the folder across her desk under the hum of a single oscillating fan. She read in silence for nearly 20 minutes, then whispered, "You realize this doesn't end in a courtroom. This ends in a lot of closed doors." Outside, the sky over Dry Creek darkened again, thunder building in the distance just as it had that day 13 years earlier. The weather radio in Mercer's cruiser crackled with a test alert, that same wavering tone that had once signaled safety and instead heralded disappearance. He sat behind the wheel listening until the sound faded into static, wondering how many storms a town could survive before it finally stopped rebuilding. The autumn storms came early that year, sweeping across western Oklahoma in violent bursts that painted the horizon green before tearing it open with lightning. On the evening of September 6, 2019, Deputy Eli Mercer sat alone in the sheriff's evidence room, the smell of old paper and bleach filling the space as rain lashed against the windows. He was cataloging the supplementary materials from the Dry Creek case, financial ledgers, interview transcripts, Shore's confession tapes, when the fluorescent lights flickered, cutting the room into alternating frames of illumination and darkness. It felt like the building itself was breathing in uneven rhythm. Mercer ignored the storm, focused on the task, handwriting meticulous labels, even though the digital archive would eventually supersede them. It was ritual, a way of keeping ghosts organized. But beneath the calm surface of bureaucratic order, a new anxiety was growing. Since discovering the financial connections implicating Superintendent McPherson's relatives, Mercer had noticed subtle shifts in his environment. Delayed email, responses, misplaced files, calls that went unanswered by agencies that once returned his messages immediately. The district attorney's office had gone quiet, citing ongoing administrative review. The Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation declined to comment on the pending inquiry. Within the department, Sheriff Clay Windsor, a former state trooper who had inherited the position after Radley's retirement, began asking pointed questions about Mercer's scope of authority. Windsor's voice carried the easy authority of someone used to being obeyed. He reminded Mercer that the murder case had already produced an arrest, that the taxpayers wanted closure, not conspiracy theories. Mercer nodded politely, said he understood, and went back to his desk to keep digging. He began with the procurement chain. The invoices Melissa Hartley had annotated all traced back to a single vendor, Sooner Industrial Supply, a warehouse based in Lawton that specialized in maintenance materials for schools and hospitals. Its owner, Randall Kerr, had died in 2008, but the company records still existed in county storage. Mercer drove to Lawton and spent a day in a dust-choked basement reviewing handwritten logs. The numbers matched Melissa's notes exactly. Shipments. Ordered under Dry Creek Unified School District, signed by Superintendent McPherson, received by Caleb Shore, and paid to an out-of-state account under a Texas address. What startled Mercer wasn't the theft itself, it was how small it was. The total misappropriated funds amounted to less than $50,000 over 3 years, barely enough to justify murder, which meant either the money was a cover for something larger, or Melissa had stumbled onto more than financial fraud. He checked the district's insurance reimbursements for disaster preparedness grants. Between 2004 and 2006, Dry Creek received federal funding for tornado shelter upgrades, including hazard mitigation reimbursements that were supposed to go toward structural reinforcement and ventilation systems. The paperwork showed that work completed by certified contractors had been inspected and approved. Yet the shelter where Melissa died failed its 2006 inspection for faulty ventilation, the same system supposedly replaced months earlier. Mercer printed every form and pinned them to his office corkboard, strings connecting dates and signatures like arteries through the paper city of corruption. The pattern pointed to falsified inspections, phantom repairs, and a network of payoffs small enough to remain invisible until a guidance aide began asking questions. In early October, Mercer drove to Edmond to request a voluntary interview with former Superintendent Gail McPherson. The woman who answered the door of the suburban ranch house looked nothing like the confident administrator from the 2006 news footage. She was thin, hair white, eyes sharp with fear rather than defiance. She invited Mercer inside reluctantly, her hands trembling as she poured coffee. "You think I told him to do it," she said without waiting for a question. Mercer stayed silent. She went on, voice cracking. "I never told Caleb to hurt anyone. I told him to keep her quiet until I could fix it. I thought he'd talk to her, maybe scare her a little, that's all." Mercer asked what she needed to fix. McPherson laughed bitterly. "Do you know how many corners this county cuts to keep its schools open? We file what the state wants to see. We build what we can afford. It's a dance, not a crime." When he pressed her about the federal reimbursements, she admitted that some of the invoices were creative. Accounting. The grant money had been diverted to cover unrelated building costs, something she claimed every rural district did to survive shrinking budgets. "If you expose that," she warned, "you'll shut down half the schools in this county." Mercer recorded the conversation under state consent law and left with a heart pounding against his ribs. He didn't trust her confession entirely. She sounded less remorseful than cornered. Still, it was the first explicit acknowledgement that Melissa's death stemmed from a chain of bureaucratic deceit rather than simple greed. The next morning, McPherson was found dead in her garage from apparent carbon monoxide poisoning. A handwritten note lay on the passenger seat of her car. "I never wanted blood on our hands. Forgive me." The sheriff's office ruled it suicide within 24 hours. Mercer was the only one who questioned the timing. At the same time, the trial of Caleb Shore began in Chickasha County Court. The prosecution presented its case methodically, building a timeline that placed Shore at the shelter, matching his tools to the adhesive residue, his shoe tread to impressions found near the site, and his DNA to skin cells recovered from the vent handle. The defense argued that Shore's mental state and lack of intent reduced the crime to manslaughter. But the jury listened to the 2019 interrogation recording where Shore said, "She promised she wouldn't bring them into it," and something in that phrase lingered like static through the courtroom. On October 15th, the verdict came back, guilty of murder in the second degree. Shore stared straight ahead as the sentence was read, 30 years without parole eligibility for 20. Outside, the wind had risen again, sweeping loose leaves down Main Street as the townspeople gathered by the courthouse steps. For many, justice felt tangible for the first time in 13 years. Melissa's parents stood together in silence, her mother clutching a photograph worn soft at the edges. Reporters called it closure. Mercer didn't attend the press conference. He sat instead in his cruiser, engine idling, staring at the courthouse clock tower. The word closure rang false. There was no closure for a woman buried under a school because she asked the wrong question. There was only containment, the same kind of containment that had hidden her body, her reports, and the truth. That night, Mercer couldn't sleep. He drove to the edge of Dry Creek Lake where the recovered shelter ruins still jutted from the mud. The forensic teams had finished their work, but the structure remained like an open wound. He parked, walked to the waterline, and stood where the concrete met silt. Lightning flashed far off over the plains, illuminating the surface of the lake for an instant. Something pale gleamed near the shoreline, plastic, half buried. He knelt and pulled it free, a small cracked keycard with the faded imprint Dry Creek USD maintenance access. The magnetic strip was corroded, but the card number was legible. He recognized it immediately as belonging to Superintendent McPherson's administrative set, the one supposedly turned in after her retirement. How it had ended up by the lake was a question that twisted Mercer's stomach into knots. He brought the card to the forensic lab in Oklahoma City. Chemical residue tests detected traces of industrial-grade sealant, the same type found in the shelter. That meant McPherson had visited the site long after Melissa's death, possibly during the 2011 reinspection. Whether she'd been there to verify the concealment or to try and uncover what she'd helped hide was impossible to know. Either way, it meant she'd lied during their conversation days earlier. Mercer's report on the new evidence reached the district attorney's office at 9 a.m. the next morning. By noon, he was called into Sheriff Windsor's office. The sheriff didn't bother with pleasantries. "Eli," he said, "you're done with this case. You've done good work, but the AG's office wants it closed. You understand?" Mercer asked whether the new evidence would be logged. Windsor shook his head slowly. "Sometimes justice isn't about digging forever. Sometimes it's about letting the dead rest." Mercer stared at the man, saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of politics pressing down from unseen levels of authority. He nodded again, knowing defiance here would end his career. That evening he cleared his desk, boxing up copies of his notes and digital backups of key evidence before officially signing off the case. But once outside, standing in the parking lot as thunder rolled across the plains, he decided he wasn't done. He mailed one set of files to a reporter he trusted at the Oklahoma Ledger, a quiet investigative journalist named Clara Neves, who had covered the state's public infrastructure scandals for years. He included a short note. "If anything happens to me, start with the shelters. The concrete isn't as solid as they say." 2 weeks later, the story broke on the front page. School grant fraud linked to 2006 Dry Creek murder, officials suspected of cover-up. The article detailed the falsified inspections, the financial shell companies, and the inconsistencies surrounding McPherson's death. The piece went viral, igniting statewide outrage. The governor ordered an independent audit of the Department of Education's disaster preparedness grants. Federal agents arrived in Dry Creek within days, their black SUVs parked outside the same courthouse where locals had celebrated justice only weeks earlier. Sheriff Windsor resigned amid allegations of evidence suppression. The school board dissolved, and emergency administrators were installed by the state. Reporters flooded back into town, broadcasting live from the cracked basketball court where students once gathered during drills. They called it the storm shelter scandal. But to the residents who had lived through the original tragedy, it was something colder, a reminder that their town's safety had been traded for paperwork and convenience. In late November, Mercer drove past the high school one final time. The gym's new foundation gleamed under fresh concrete, and a chain-link fence surrounded the excavation zone. He parked at the edge of the lot, listening to the muted sounds of construction. For the first time in years, there was no wind. The sky held still, low and gray, as if waiting. He thought about Melissa Hartley, about how she had probably stood in the same silence 13 years earlier before the sirens began, clipboard in hand, believing the drill was just another exercise in preparedness. He thought about all the systems built to protect people, schools, shelters, departments, hierarchies, and how easily they turned inward, sealing their own vents, suffocating those who asked questions. Then he turned the ignition and drove north toward Oklahoma City, the wipers beating time against a windshield smeared with red dust and rain. Behind him, Dry Creek receded into the plain, its grain elevators and church steeple swallowed by the horizon. Hit the like button if you believe cold cases deserve more attention. Ahead, the storm gathered again, low and wide, stretching across the entire sky. The winter of 2019 arrived without snow, but with the kind of endless gray overcast that dulled the edges of everything it touched. By then, Dry Creek had become a name that crawled across every true crime program, every podcast, every late-night pundit's rhetorical flourish about small-town secrets. The storm shelter scandal had metastasized into a symbol of rural decay and moral corrosion, the kind of headline that refused to die. For Deputy Eli Mercer, it meant sleepless nights and a phone that never stopped vibrating. Federal investigators from the Department of Education's Office of Inspector General requested interviews. Network producers offered book deals. Conspiracy. Theorists emailed him sketches of storm shelters shaped like coffins. But when he looked in the mirror each morning, what stared back wasn't vindication. It was the hollow-eyed certainty that the story was still incomplete. In December, while helping federal auditors sift through old district records, Mercer found something that reignited his unease. Inside a box labeled FEMA Correspondence 2005-2006, wedged between routine inspection memos, was a torn envelope addressed to the Grady County Emergency Management Office. The postmark read May 2, 2006, one day before the drill. The letter inside, written in Melissa Hartley's tidy cursive, stated, "Regarding the upcoming safety drill, I have concerns about the structural soundness of the south shelter. Please ensure an independent inspection prior to student use. Monsieur Hartley." The letter had never been logged. The discovery confirmed that she had tried to warn someone, tried to prevent the very disaster that would claim her life. Mercer felt a sharp sting of grief disguised as anger. He wondered how many times that letter had been moved from one box to another, passed by a dozen indifferent hands, all of them too busy to notice that the warning was signed by a woman who would vanish the next day. The federal probe expanded, revealing that Dry Creek wasn't an isolated case. Over 15 Oklahoma school districts were found to have filed falsified inspection reports during the early 2000s to secure federal hazard mitigation grants. Some of those shelters had structural flaws so severe that they were later condemned. McPherson's creative accounting was only one small corner of a statewide web of negligence. The Attorney General's office promised reform, but for the families in Dry Creek it was just more paperwork. Another round of statements and hearings that blurred together. Mercer testified before a grand jury in Oklahoma City that January, outlining the timeline from Melissa's disappearance to Shore's arrest. When he described uncovering her button from the evidence locker and realizing that Pollen could talk, several jurors wiped their eyes. The chairwoman thanked him afterward for his persistence. He nodded, but her gratitude felt misplaced. He hadn't brought Melissa back. He'd just found the box where she'd been buried twice, once under concrete, once under bureaucracy. 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived at Mercer's apartment without a return address. Inside was a single USB drive. The file on it was audio, muffled, distorted, but recognizable as radio chatter. A male voice, older, hoarse, said, "You think it stopped at McPherson? You think you're safe just because the cameras left?" Then a burst of static, followed by, "Check the county storage barns. You missed what's underneath." Mercer ran a trace through his contacts and communications forensics, but the signal originated from a disposable prepaid phone. Whoever sent it knew how to stay invisible. The next morning, before dawn, he drove south on Highway 81 toward the old county maintenance facility, a compound of corrugated metal sheds surrounded by prairie grass. It had been abandoned since 2015 after flooding damaged the foundations. The first barn he entered smelled of motor oil and mildew. Dust motes swirled in his flashlight beam like snow. Rows of rusting equipment lined the walls: generators, storm sirens, stacks of unused sandbags. In the far corner stood a partially collapsed structure covered with a tarp. When Mercer pulled it back, he froze. Underneath lay the top half of a prefabricated shelter door identical to the model installed at Dry Creek High. The serial tag had been filed off, but faint etching remained. Series 3S. Manufactured 2005. He photographed everything, then pried open a nearby crate marked Archives. Inside were dozens of inspection reports stamped Void, many bearing McPherson's signature. More disturbing were the handwritten notes scribbled in the margins, used for replacement parts, test vents here, and in one corner, disposed discreetly, same method DC. DC, Dry Creek. Mercer's stomach turned cold. Whoever had written that had treated the concealment of a woman's death as a logistical template. When he brought the findings to the federal investigators, they confirmed that the barn had been used as an unofficial parts depot for shelter contractors. But the files also contained reference numbers connected to a second manufacturer that had supplied shelters to multiple districts. The logistics manager for that company, Randall Kerr Jr., was the son of the original vendor who died in 2008. Kerr Jr. had inherited the business, sold it, and relocated to Texas in 2012. Records showed he'd worked closely with McPherson and other superintendents during the grant period. Mercer suspected the corruption extended into procurement, kickbacks for signing inspection approvals. The idea that Melissa had stumbled into that network by asking questions about invoices now felt inevitable rather than tragic. Meanwhile, Clara Neves continued publishing follow-up articles in the Oklahoma Ledger, each one peeling back another layer of deceit. One feature, titled "The Woman Who Saw the Crack in the Concrete," focused entirely on Melissa's life before the disappearance, her volunteer work, her ambition to become a counselor, her quiet insistence that safety drills should matter. The article humanized her beyond the headlines, and the public responded with renewed empathy. Donations flooded the scholarship fund created in her name. The town's narrative began to shift from shame to remembrance. But for Mercer, the comfort of collective mourning couldn't replace the gnawing question left by that anonymous voice. You missed what's underneath. In February 2020, state contractors began demolishing the remaining unused shelters across Grady County. On-site engineers discovered anomalies beneath several foundations, sealed access panels, buried metal drums, and in one case, a concrete cavity lined with waterproof plastic sheeting. Inside that cavity, investigators found dozens of discarded maintenance logs, stripped identification tags, and a rusted toolbox containing duplicate inspection seals. The serial numbers matched those used on the falsified reports from 2006. The discovery proved the existence of an organized cover-up, not just local negligence. Yet even as the truth widened, the story's center remained Melissa's death. Every document, every sealed door circled back to the moment she disappeared during a routine drill. One evening in March, Mercer visited her parents in Texas. They lived in a small ranch-style house outside Denton, quiet and immaculately kept. Her mother, Linda, greeted him with weary kindness, her hands trembling as she poured sweet tea. "They tell us justice was done," she said, "but I keep dreaming she's still down there, still knocking." Mercer told her about the scholarship, the national attention, the reforms underway. She listened politely, eyes distant. "They'll forget," she said softly. "They always do." He drove back to Oklahoma in silence, her words looping in his head like a radio echo. By April, the federal task force filed its preliminary report, concluding that at least 4 district officials across Oklahoma had knowingly falsified inspection records tied to McPherson's network. 2 were indicted. A 3rd committed suicide before arrest. The investigation's scope threatened to pull in state-level administrators. The Attorney General's office released a statement promising full accountability. Yet privately, Mercer sensed the system already shifting toward self-preservation again. The focus was moving away from Dry Creek, toward policy failures and structural oversight issues. The human story, the woman sealed beneath a school during a safety drill, was being buried under abstractions. That summer, as the anniversary of Melissa's disappearance approached, Mercer drove back to Dry Creek one final time. The high school stood empty, awaiting renovation. The gymnasium's concrete foundation had been cut open for forensic reinspection, exposing a rectangular void like a wound refusing to close. He walked to the edge, peered down at the rough earth, and for the first time allowed himself to imagine the moment itself. Melissa's confusion as the door clanged shut, her fists pounding against steel while the sirens wailed outside. He tried to picture what she'd thought. Panic, disbelief, maybe even pity for the man who'd trapped her. The thought hollowed him. He knelt, placed his hand on the cold concrete, and whispered, "We found you." Then quieter, "But we didn't save you." The wind rose suddenly, sweeping dust across the open floor. and for a brief second it sounded like a breath exhaled from the earth itself. In the months that followed, Mercer left the sheriff's department. He joined a federal investigative unit specializing in infrastructure fraud, relocating to Kansas. The transfer felt less like promotion than exile. Dry Creek receded in the rearview mirror of his life. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he would wake to the sound of faint sirens and remember the way the radio had hissed that single unfinished word, wait. He kept the original recording on a small drive in his desk drawer. Occasionally he played it, not to analyze, but to remind himself that behind every bureaucratic statistic, there's a moment where someone begged for help and no one heard. 2 years later, when an Oklahoma journalist called to tell him that the state had dedicated a memorial plaque at the rebuilt high school, Mercer listened but didn't answer. The reporter described the inscription, "In memory of Melissa Hartley," whose courage uncovered truth. He thought about the phrase, about how neat and complete it sounded, how it erased the mess of everything that had come after. The truth, he knew, wasn't uncovered. It was still there, buried under layers of politics and silence, waiting for someone else to dig again. As dusk fell over his new town, Mercer stepped outside, the air thick with the smell of wet soil. A thunderhead loomed on the horizon, stretching across the Kansas plain like an old memory. He closed his eyes and listened. Somewhere deep in that rolling distance, the sirens began to wail. By spring 2022, Dry Creek no longer looked like the place it had been when the sirens first sounded 16 years earlier. The wheat fields had crept closer to town, swallowing the abandoned football field and the empty faculty parking lot. The high school itself was gone, reduced to a rectangle of asphalt and rebar fenced off by orange netting while state contractors debated what to build in its place: a memorial, a new school, or simply a concrete pad to erase what couldn't be rebuilt. The only constant was the wind, restless as ever, moving through the prairie grass like the memory of everything lost. For most people, the story was over. Caleb Shore served his sentence in the state penitentiary at McAllister. The federal investigation concluded with a quiet press release citing administrative fraud and gross negligence in multiple school districts. No one else was charged in connection with Melissa Hartley's death. The media moved on to fresher scandals. The Dry Creek case was archived under resolved, though every investigator who had touched it knew resolution was only a word, not a state of being. Eli Mercer hadn't returned to Oklahoma since transferring to Kansas, but the case followed him. Every new file he opened, every infrastructure audit he reviewed, seemed to echo Dry Creek's pattern: numbers altered to satisfy funding requirements, safety protocols performed like rituals rather than protections. He told himself that it was different now, that lessons had been learned, but he didn't quite believe it. His supervisors praised his persistence, his attention to detail. They called it dedication. He called it insomnia. The dreams came nightly, the shelter door closing, the muffled sound of fists on metal, the silence that followed. In early May, an email appeared in his inbox with no sender listed. The subject line read, 2006 drill footage, confidential. Attached was a compressed video file. When he opened it, grainy security footage filled the screen. The west corridor of Dry Creek High, time-stamped 11:34 a.m., May 3, 2006, 3 minutes before Melissa vanished. The camera panned across a line of students crouched against the lockers. Then in the far corner, a figure stepped into frame, a man in maintenance overalls, face obscured by the brim of a cap, holding a clipboard. He motioned toward the stairwell. Seconds later, Melissa appeared, speaking to him briefly before following out of sight. The resolution was too poor to identify the man, but what chilled Mercer wasn't the motion. It was the date stamp on the lower right corner. The footage had been captured by a camera that the district claimed had malfunctioned that week and produced no recordings. Someone had preserved a copy. The file's metadata contained a location tag: Grady County Records Annex, Storage Drive B. Mercer sat for a long time staring at the screen, the cursor blinking over the name of a town he'd tried to forget. The next morning, without requesting authorization, he drove south across the border, through the pale flatlands where telephone poles stretched like metronomes marking the distance between past and present. The annex was easy to find, a concrete bunker half sunk into red dirt built to store county archives. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Rows of filing cabinets stood like tombstones. In the far corner, A desktop computer sat covered in a plastic sheet, still connected to an external hard drive labeled Serve 2006 Backup. Mercer powered it on. The directory contained dozens of video files, most corrupted, some intact. He clicked through them. Empty hallways, classrooms, the gym. Then one labeled South Shelter External Cam opened onto a static image of the bunker's entrance. At 11:37 a.m., the door moved. A figure appeared, same overalls, same cap, and knelt to the latch, sliding something metallic across the frame. The video glitched, cutting to static. When it returned, the door stood closed and the figure was gone. Mercer exported the file and copied the metadata to his flash drive. He felt the familiar chill of evidence that shouldn't exist. The kind of artifact buried precisely because it told the truth too clearly. As he left the annex, he noticed a small plaque by the entrance, newly installed. Records maintained by Grady County Facilities Division. The name etched beneath, Supervisor R. Vaughn. Principal Vaughn. The same man who had first reported Melissa missing. He sat in his car, heart pounding, replaying every moment of Vaughn's testimony during the 2019 trial. The hesitation when asked if he'd ever suspected anyone. The tremor in his voice when he said they hadn't looked close enough at their own people. Mercer suddenly realized what that sentence might have meant. Not guilt, confession. Vaughn had been Superintendent McPherson's closest ally. He'd signed off on every inspection, approved every drill schedule, and, crucially, controlled the security camera system. If he'd discovered Melissa's letter to emergency management on May the 2nd, he might have confronted her, realized she intended to escalate beyond the district, and acted to protect the network that kept his schools funded. Shore had been a tool, not a mastermind. By the time Mercer reached Norman that night, he'd located Vaughn's address through public records. The house sat on the edge of a retirement subdivision, lights glowing warmly behind lace curtains. He parked down the street, watching. Through the window he saw Vaughn, older, frailer, moving carefully with a cane. The man looked harmless, almost pitiable. But when Mercer thought of the shelter door, of Melissa's letter and the vanished footage, pity curdled into resolve. He rang the doorbell. Vaughn opened slowly, surprise flickering across his face before recognition set in. "Deputy Mercer," he said softly. "I figured you'd come eventually." He stepped aside. Inside, the living room smelled of pipe smoke and lemon polish. On a side table sat a framed photograph of the 2006 faculty, Melissa among them, smiling. "I kept that," Vaughn said when he noticed Mercer looking. "Reminds me of what happens when you try to do the right thing in the wrong place." Mercer didn't sit. "You saved the tapes," he said. Vaughn nodded once. "I couldn't destroy them. Not after what we did." The words hung in the air like dust. Vaughn sank into an armchair, hands trembling. "It was supposed to be a warning, not a death. Gail told me to stall her until the board could fix the books. But Caleb panicked. When I found out he'd locked her in, it was too late. The sheriff was already on site. I sealed the footage so the district wouldn't collapse. I told myself I was protecting the students. Maybe I was just protecting myself." Mercer's voice came out quieter than he expected. "Why keep it all these years?" Vaughn stared at the photo. "Because I knew someday someone would come asking. And when they did, I wanted them to know she wasn't forgotten." He handed Mercer a small envelope. Inside were 2 items, a brass locker key marked 12B, and a folded piece of stationery in the same cursive handwriting Mercer recognized instantly. The letter was dated the morning of the disappearance. "Mr. Vaughn, thank you for supporting the shelter safety review. I know the paperwork is tedious, but I believe transparency keeps everyone safe. I'll submit the reports this afternoon." Melissa's optimism spilled from every looped letter. Vaughn's voice cracked. She believed in the system. "We taught her to." For a moment, neither spoke. The clock ticked, thunder rolling faintly outside. Finally, Mercer said, "You need to make this official." Vaughn shook his head slowly. "My confession won't bring her back. It'll only bury what's left of this town. You've seen what truth does here. It doesn't cleanse. It corrodes." He leaned back, eyes half closed. "You want justice, Deputy? Dig where they're building the memorial. That's where they poured the rest of it." When Mercer returned to Dry Creek the next morning, contractors were already laying rebar across the new foundation. He flashed his old credentials, stepped over caution tape, and walked to the center of the site where the gym once stood. The soil had a peculiar texture, packed unevenly, streaked with gray ash rather than the red clay surrounding it. He knelt, scraped at the surface with a trowel, and felt metal. Within minutes, he unearthed a flat steel box sealed with epoxy. Inside, wrapped in waterproof plastic, were 3 hard drives labeled Aide Min 2006 Finals. The serial numbers matched the school's original accounting system, the one that supposedly crashed the month after Melissa's death. The drives contained scanned invoices, emails between McPherson and state contractors, and a series of correspondence threads marked Urgent, Compliance Review. The last message was dated May 3, 2006, 10:21 a.m., sent from Melissa's account to Vaughn's inbox. Please confirm you received my letter. We can't ignore this any longer. He stared at the screen until the text blurred. Then he called the Federal Task Force liaison, explaining what he'd found. The response was cautious. The files would be seized, verified, and cataloged, but the case itself remained closed. We appreciate your diligence, the agent said, but this falls outside your jurisdiction now. Mercer laughed, a dry, bitter sound. Outside his jurisdiction, like the truth had borders. He stayed long enough to watch them lift the steel box into an evidence van. As the doors closed, he realized that for all the layers peeled back, the story would still end the same way it began, with a woman trapped beneath something she tried to fix. The state would issue statements, commissions would convene, and eventually new names would fill the headlines. But the sound that would never fade was the silence that followed the sirens. That night, as he drove north again, the sky cracked open with lightning. Rain hit the windshield in chaotic bursts, each drop illuminated by the passing glow of distant towns. At the border, his radio crackled with the emergency broadcast test tone, the same wavering pitch he'd heard the day he first opened the old tape. He turned up the volume. Through the static, for just a moment, he thought he heard a woman's voice, soft, calm, resolute, saying, "It matters." Then the signal vanished. He pulled over on the shoulder, engine idling, hands gripping the steering wheel. Beyond the highway, the plains stretched into darkness, endless and unbroken. He realized that what haunted him wasn't the death, nor the lies, but the simple human certainty that someone had tried to do good and been destroyed for it. In the end, every system, school, county, state, had acted exactly as designed, preserving itself. The only thing that hadn't was Melissa Hartley, who had believed that truth mattered more than convenience. As dawn bled across the horizon, Mercer drove on, the world washed clean by rain but unchanged. The case file would rest in archives, the memorial would rise over sealed foundations, and future generations would walk those halls unaware of what lay beneath. But somewhere, beneath miles of Oklahoma clay, the wind still moved through the cracks of old concrete, whispering the name of the woman who refused to stay silent,